The scorching sun beat down on Tabitha Lane as she stood at the edge of Ruby City, Nebraska, clutching her 6-month-old daughter to her chest, her worn cotton dress sticking to her skin in the unforgiving heat of 1878. The whispers had turned to outright rejection, and today she'd been evicted from her small rented room above the general store, the landlady's words still burning in her ears. "We don't house women of your character in decent establishments." Tabitha wiped away a tear as little Emma whimpered against her shoulder. The child, with her wisps of auburn hair and bright blue eyes, was innocent of the circumstances of her birth, yet bore the brunt of the town's judgment alongside her mother. 22 years of life had not prepared Tabitha for such cruelty from people she'd known her entire life. Ruby City had once been her haven. Her parents had brought her here as a child, and when they'd both succumbed to influenza 3 years ago, the town had rallied around her. But that support had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh prairie sun when she'd returned from visiting her cousin in Omaha with a swollen belly and no husband. She refused to name Emma's father not out of shame, but protection. James Walsh had been charming, handsome, and ultimately violent when she'd refused his advances. What had happened afterward was not something she could bring herself to speak of, even when the minister demanded a public confession of her sins. "Come on, Emma," she whispered, bouncing the fussy infant gently. "We'll figure something out." With her carpetbag in one hand and Emma balanced on her hip, Tabitha began walking down the dusty road leading out of town. She had nowhere to go, just a few dollars sewn into the hem of her dress, and the desperate hope of finding work at one of the outlying ranches. From the shadows of the livery stable, Preston O'Malley watched the young woman's retreating figure. At 30, he'd seen enough of human cruelty to recognize injustice when it walked right past him. Preston had only been in Ruby City for 8 months, purchasing land just outside town to start his own small ranch after years of driving cattle across the territories. He'd noticed the red-haired woman before it was hard not to in a town this size, and had heard the whispers, the judgment, the condemnation. Preston had never been one for town gossip or righteous indignation. Life on the trail had taught him that everyone carried their own burdens, and it wasn't his place to add to them. "Mr. O'Malley," called Silas Turner, the livery owner, "those horseshoes you ordered came in yesterday." Preston nodded absently, his eyes still following the diminutive figure growing smaller in the distance. "What's her story?" he asked, nodding toward Tabitha. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "The Lane girl got herself in trouble, came back with a baby and no husband. Been living above Mercer's store, but seems Sarah Mercer finally had enough of harboring a woman of loose morals. Town's been scandalized for months." Preston frowned. "And no one's offered her help. Reverend Holcomb said she could stay if she'd give up the child and repent publicly." "Stubborn girl refused." Silas shrugged as if her predicament was of no consequence. "She made her bed." "And now she has no bed at all," Preston muttered, watching as Tabitha disappeared around a bend in the road. With a decisive motion, he swung himself onto his bay gelding. "I'll be back for those horseshoes later, Silas." Preston rode at an unhurried pace, not wanting to frighten the woman. As he approached, he could see her shoulders were squared despite the obvious weight of her burdens. She turned at the sound of hoofbeats, her face a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. "Miss Lane," he said, tipping his hat and keeping his voice gentle. "The name's Preston O'Malley. I have a ranch about 3 miles down this road." Tabitha regarded him cautiously. His face was sun-weathered but kind, with crow's feet at the corners of hazel eyes. His dark hair curled slightly under the brim of his hat, and his broad shoulders spoke of a life of hard work. "Mr. O'Malley," she acknowledged stiffly, shifting Emma to her other hip. The infant stared at the newcomer with solemn eyes. "Looks like you might be in need of a place to stay," Preston said, nodding at her carpetbag. Tabitha lifted her chin. "I am looking for work if that's what you're asking." "As it happens, I could use some help around the place," Preston said. It's not much yet, just a cabin, a small barn, and some fenced land, but there's a lean-to off the back of the cabin that could be fixed up proper. You'd have your privacy." Suspicion clouded her face. "Why would you offer help when everyone else in town has turned their back?" Preston shifted in his saddle. "I've spent most of my life on cattle drives and in mining camps, seen all kinds of folks in all kinds of trouble, never found judging others did much good for anyone. I won't be beholden to any man," Tabitha said firmly, "and I won't accept charity." "Good, because I'm not offering any," Preston replied. "I need someone to cook and keep house while I'm working the land and livestock. Hard to do both. You'll earn your keep, and you and your little one will have a roof." Emma chose that moment to let out a cry, her small face reddening with the effort. "She's hungry," Tabitha explained, her resolve wavering visibly. "And I haven't had time to find provisions." Preston nodded toward his horse. "I've got enough food at the ranch, and you can start earning your keep today by making a supper. Climb up behind me, it's too far to walk in this heat, especially with the little one." For a long moment, Tabitha hesitated. Pride warred with practicality as Emma's cries grew more insistent. Finally, she nodded. "Just until I can find something more suitable," she stipulated. Preston dismounted to help her up, careful not to touch her more than necessary as she situated herself behind him with Emma cradled between them. He felt her tentative grasp on his shirt as they started moving. They rode in silence, the only sounds Emma's occasional whimpers and the rhythmic hoofbeats of Preston's gelding, Thunder. As they crested a small rise, Preston's ranch came into view, modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy log cabin nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees. A small creek wound its way behind the property, and a corral held 3 horses who raised their heads at their approach. "It's not much," Preston said as they dismounted, "but it's peaceful." Tabitha took in the surroundings with appreciative eyes. "It's lovely," she admitted. "How long have you been here?" "Bought the land 8 months ago, been working on it ever since." Preston led her to the cabin, a simple structure with a stone chimney. Inside was sparse but clean: a wooden table with 4 chairs, a cast iron stove, some shelves with provisions, and a curtained-off sleeping area. "The lean-to's through there," Preston said, pointing to a door at the back of the cabin. "Like I said, it needs work, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. We can fix it up proper over the next few days." Tabitha followed him through the door to find a small space that indeed needed attention. The roof had a few spots where sunlight filtered through, and the dirt floor was bare. "I can make this comfortable," she said, surveying the space with a homemaker's eye. "But I'll need supplies." "Make a list," Preston said. "I'll ride into town tomorrow." Tabitha's eyes clouded. "The townspeople won't look kindly on you helping me." Preston shrugged. "I don't much care what the townspeople think. Never have." He showed her where the provisions were kept, pointed out the well nearby, and then excused himself to tend to his horses, giving her space to settle in. Tabitha found herself alone in a strange man's cabin, yet somehow felt safer than she had in months. She set Emma down on a folded blanket and quickly investigated the food stores. There was flour, salt, coffee, bacon, beans, and even some dried apples. She set to work preparing a simple meal, grateful for the task that kept her hands and mind occupied. As dusk fell, Preston returned to find a hot meal waiting: beans flavored with bacon, cornbread still steaming from the oven, and coffee brewing on the stove. He washed up outside before sitting down at the table. "This is more than I've had in one sitting for months," he said appreciatively, breaking open a piece of cornbread. Tabitha fed Emma small spoonfuls of mashed beans before addressing her own hunger. "Thank you for taking us in, Mr. O'Malley." "Preston," he corrected. "And you're welcome, though like I said, it's a fair exchange. I need the help." They ate in relative silence, the awkwardness of strangers forced into intimate proximity by circumstance. After dinner, Tabitha insisted on washing the dishes while Preston fashioned a makeshift cradle for Emma from a wooden crate and some blankets. "It's not fancy," he apologized, placing it in the lean-to. "It's perfect. Tabitha said softly, touched by his thoughtfulness. That night, as she lay on the pallet Preston had made for her in the lean-to, Emma sleeping peacefully in her improvised cradle, Tabitha stared at the stars visible through the gaps in the roof. For the first time in many months, she felt a flicker of hope. Preston, in his own bed on the other side of the wall, lay awake thinking about the woman and child he'd brought into his home. He'd acted on impulse, something he rarely did, and now wondered at the wisdom of it. But as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't bring himself to regret the decision. The next morning, Tabitha awoke to find Preston already gone from the cabin, a note on the table informing her he'd ridden out to check on the cattle and would be back by midday. She spent the morning cleaning the cabin thoroughly, discovering in the process that her benefactor lived more spartanly than necessary. When Preston returned, sweaty and dust covered from his morning's work, he found the cabin transformed. It was cleaner than it had been since he'd built it, and the smell of stew simmering on the stove made his stomach growl appreciatively. "You've been busy," he observed, noting that even his few personal possessions had been arranged more neatly. "Earning my keep," Tabitha replied, not looking up from where she was mending one of his shirts. "I made a list of supplies if you're still willing to go to town." Preston took the list she offered, scanning it quickly. "Nails, fabric, thread, oats. Seems reasonable. I'll go after we eat." During the simple meal, Preston found himself studying Tabitha when she wasn't looking. She was prettier than he'd initially realized, with delicate features and expressive eyes that changed from gray to almost blue depending on the light. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but wisps escaped to frame her face. "If you don't mind me asking," he said carefully, "how old is your daughter?" Tabitha's hand paused midway to her mouth. "Emma is 6 months old." Preston nodded, not pushing further, and they finished the meal in silence. True to his word, Preston rode into Ruby City that afternoon. The general store was busy when he entered, and a hush fell over the customers as he handed Tabitha's list to Howard Mercer, the proprietor. "Heard you took in the Lane girl," Howard said, his disapproval evident as he gathered the items. Preston met his gaze steadily. "Miss Lane is working as my housekeeper." Sarah Mercer, who had been arranging fabric bolts, sniffed audibly. "I hope you know what you're inviting into your home, Mr. O'Malley. That woman refused to name her child's father or repent her sin. Reverend Holcomb offered her a path to redemption, and she spurned it. With all due respect, Mrs. Mercer," Preston said evenly, "I find it curious how a town so full of Christian folks can't seem to recall the part about not casting the first stone." The store fell silent. Howard Mercer's face reddened as he finished packing the supplies. "That'll be $2.40. Preston paid without comment, gathered his purchases, and left, aware of the eyes following him. As he mounted Thunder, he noticed Reverend Holcomb approaching, his thin face set in righteous lines. "Mr. O'Malley," the minister called, "I'd like a word." Preston waited, one hand resting on his saddle horn. "Reverend, I understand you've taken Tabitha Lane into your home," Holcomb said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure those nearby could hear. "As a man of God, I must warn you against harboring a fallen woman. It reflects poorly on your character and standing in this community." "With respect, Reverend, I haven't been in this community long enough to have much standing," Preston replied calmly. "And as for Miss Lane, she's doing honest work for fair pay. I fail to see how that makes either of us fallen." "That child was born in sin." "That child," Preston interrupted, his voice hardening, "is an innocent. And from what I've seen, her mother is doing everything possible to give her a decent life, despite the obstacles put in her way by those who should be offering Christian charity." Reverend Holcomb's face mottled with anger. "You would do well to mind your associations, Mr. O'Malley. This town has standards." Preston settled his hat more firmly on his head. "So do I, Reverend. Good day to you." He rode out of town feeling the weight of disapproval behind him, but strangely unburdened by it. He'd never much cared for the opinions of others, especially those who wielded religion like a weapon. When he returned to the ranch, he found Tabitha hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between two trees. Emma was asleep in her crate cradle, which Tabitha had brought outside to keep in the shade while she worked. "How was town?" she asked, not meeting his eyes. "About as expected," Preston replied, unloading his purchases. "Got everything on your list plus some sugar and dried peaches. Thought you might like them." Tabitha's hands stilled on the damp shirt she was hanging. "They talked about me." It wasn't a question, but Preston answered anyway. "They did. I didn't listen much," she nodded, returning to her task. "They'll talk about you now, too. Association with me has a cost." "I've survived worse than wagging tongues," Preston said, carrying the supplies into the cabin. When he returned, he brought tools and began examining the lean-to's exterior. "What are you doing?" Tabitha asked, finishing with the laundry. "Figuring what needs fixing first," Preston replied. "That roof's got to be patched before the next rain, and I'm thinking a proper floor would make it more comfortable for you and Emma." Tabitha stood beside him, surveying the structure with a critical eye. "The roof first," she agreed, "and perhaps a window. It gets awfully dark in there." Preston nodded. "A window it is. I've got some glass panes stored in the barn, was saving them for when I expanded the main cabin, but this is more important." Their eyes met briefly, and Tabitha felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's just a window," Preston replied, looking away first. "Not just for that," Tabitha said. "For everything." Preston cleared his throat. "Well, let's get started then. Daylight's wasting." They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, Preston showing Tabitha how to measure and cut wood for patching the roof while he crafted a simple frame for the window. Emma woke and was content to watch from her cradle, occasionally cooing or reaching for the wood shavings that fell near her. As the sun began to set, they had made significant progress. The roof was patched, and the window frame was ready to be installed the next day. They were both dirty and tired, but shared a sense of accomplishment as they washed up for supper. Over the meal, Preston found himself opening up more than usual, telling Tabitha about his years as a cowboy, driving herds from Texas to Kansas and beyond. "What made you decide to settle down?" she asked, genuinely curious. Preston considered the question. "Got tired of always moving, I suppose." "Wanted something of my own." He gazed around the cabin. "Something permanent." Tabitha nodded, understanding. "That's all I've wanted too, just a place for Emma and me, somewhere safe." "You'll have that," Preston promised, the words coming before he'd fully thought them through. "You can stay here as long as you need." Tabitha's eyes filled unexpectedly. "You're a good man, Preston O'Malley." Preston looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude, just doing what anyone should. "But no one else did," Tabitha said quietly. The following days fell into a rhythm. Preston would rise early to tend to the animals and work the land, while Tabitha managed the household chores and cared for Emma. In the afternoons, they often worked together on improving the lean-to, which was rapidly transforming into a proper room. Preston installed the window, added a wooden floor, and built a small dresser for Tabitha's few belongings. Tabitha sewed curtains from fabric he'd brought from town and stuffed a proper mattress with clean straw, covering it with the sheets she'd hemmed. A week into this arrangement, Preston returned from checking his fences to find Tabitha sitting on the cabin's porch, tears streaming down her face. Emma was asleep inside, giving her mother a rare moment alone. "Tabitha," he asked, alarm rising in his chest. "What's wrong, is it, Emma?" She wiped her eyes hastily. "No, Emma's fine. I'm sorry you caught me like this. It's nothing." Preston sat beside her on the porch step, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Doesn't look like nothing." Tabitha sighed, looking out across the land that stretched before them, golden in the late afternoon light. "I received a letter from my cousin in Omaha. The postmaster delivered it while you were out." She hesitated. "She writes that she told some mutual acquaintances where I was." "People from Ruby City will learn about what happened in Omaha." Preston waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. I didn't tell anyone here the truth, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. They all assumed I'd been promiscuous. It was easier to let them think that than explain. You don't owe me any explanations, Preston said gently. I think I do, Tabitha replied. You've taken us in, given us shelter, treated us with kindness. You deserve to know who you're helping. She took a deep breath. I went to visit my cousin Martha last year. While I was there, I met a man named James Walsh at a social gathering. He was charming, attentive, and persistent. When I refused his advances, her voice faltered. He forced himself on me. Afterward, I was too ashamed to tell anyone except Martha. When I discovered I was with child, I couldn't stay in Omaha where I might encounter him again, so I came back here. Preston's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This man, he was never punished, Tabitha laughed bitterly. He's the son of a prominent businessman in Omaha. Who would believe my word against his? Besides, I had no proof beyond my own account. And when you returned here pregnant, everyone assumed I'd been immoral, Tabitha finished. I didn't correct them. Somehow, being thought wanton seemed less shameful than being known as a victim. At least this way they believed I'd had a choice. Preston was quiet for a long moment, digesting her words. You've nothing to be ashamed of, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Nothing at all. Tabitha looked at him, searching his face for judgment and finding none. The town will know soon. The gossip will be worse than before. Let them talk, Preston said firmly. What happened to you wasn't your fault, and Emma is an innocent child deserving of all the love and protection we can give her. The word "we" hung in the air between them, unexpectedly intimate. Thank you, Tabitha said softly, for listening, for believing me. Preston stood, offering her his hand to help her up. Always, he promised, the simple word carrying the weight of an oath. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie, bringing with it sheeting rain and booming thunder that rattled the cabin's windows. Emma, frightened by the noise, wailed inconsolably, and Tabitha walked the floor with her, trying to soothe the terrified infant. Preston, who had been reading by lamplight, set aside his book. May I? He asked, holding out his arms. Surprised, Tabitha handed Emma to him. The child hiccuped mid-cry, startled by the change, and stared up at Preston with wide eyes. Hello there, little lady, he said softly, cradling her against his broad chest. That thunder's mighty loud, isn't it? But it can't hurt you in here. You're safe. He began to hum a low, soothing melody, rocking slightly as he did. Gradually, Emma's cries subsided, her tiny hand clutching at Preston's shirt as her eyelids grew heavy. How did you do that? Tabitha asked in wonder as Emma drifted off to sleep. Preston smiled, a gentle expression that transformed his usually serious face. My sister had 4 little ones. I used to help her when her husband was working late at the mill. You never mentioned a sister, Tabitha said, realizing how little she actually knew about the man who had opened his home to her. Sarah, Preston said, his smile fading. She died of typhoid 3 years ago along with 2 of her children. Her husband took the remaining boys back east to live with his parents afterward. He looked down at Emma's sleeping face. I haven't seen them since. I'm so sorry, Tabitha said, understanding better now his willingness to help a woman with a child. You must miss them terribly. Preston nodded, carefully handing Emma back to her mother. Every day, but life goes on. He cleared his throat. You should get some sleep. I'll bank the fire before turning in. Tabitha took Emma to their room, which no longer felt like a temporary shelter but a space that was truly theirs. As she placed her daughter in her cradle, she found herself thinking about Preston, his kindness, his strength, the gentleness with which he'd held Emma. Dangerous thoughts for a woman in her position. The next morning dawned clear and washed clean by the storm. Preston had already left to assess any damage to his fences and crops, leaving Tabitha to her usual routine. She was hanging fresh laundry when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Shielding her eyes against the sun, she made out 2 figures, a man driving and a woman seated beside him. With a sinking feeling, she recognized Reverend Holcomb and his wife, Matilda. gathering her courage, Tabitha straightened her apron and waited as the wagon pulled up to the cabin. The Holcombs descended, both wearing expressions of grim determination. "Miss Lane," the Reverend said stiffly, "we've come to speak with you on a matter of some urgency." "Reverend Holcomb, Mrs. Holcomb," Tabitha acknowledged with a nod. "Mr. O'Malley is not here at present." "It's you we've come to see," Matilda Holcomb said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "We've received word from Omaha about your situation." Tabitha felt her face grow hot but held her ground. "I see, and what might that be?" Reverend Holcomb cleared his throat. "We understand now the nature of your misfortune. While the circumstances are regrettable, they do not change the fact that you have an illegitimate child." "Emma is my daughter," Tabitha said firmly. "There is nothing illegitimate about her." "We've come to offer you a path to respectability," Matilda continued as if Tabitha hadn't spoken. "The Sisters of Mercy in Lincoln have agreed to take the child. You could then return to Ruby City, confess your victimhood, and be welcomed back into the community with Christian forgiveness." Tabitha stared at them in disbelief. "You want me to give away my daughter?" "It would be best for everyone," Reverend Holcomb said. "The child would be raised in a godly environment and you could start afresh. Perhaps in time a suitable marriage could be arranged." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Tabitha had intended. "I will not abandon my child." "Not for respectability, not for acceptance, not for anything." Matilda's face hardened. "You're being selfish. What kind of life can you provide for that girl, living in sin with a bachelor rancher, no father, no family name?" "I am providing her with love," Tabitha said, anger rising. "And we are not living in sin. Mr. O'Malley has been nothing but respectful and kind, which is more than I can say for those who claim to follow Christ's teachings." "You leave us no choice then," Reverend Holcomb said coldly. "We cannot in good conscience allow a child to be raised in such circumstances. I shall be writing to the territorial authorities about this situation." The threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. Tabitha knew what it meant. They could petition to have Emma taken from her on grounds of moral unsuitability. "I think you should leave," came a deep voice from behind them. Tabitha turned to see Preston dismounting from Thunder, his expression dangerously calm. "Mr. O'Malley," Reverend Holcomb began, "we were just explaining to Miss Lane." "I heard what you were explaining," Preston interrupted, coming to stand beside Tabitha. "And now I'm explaining to you that you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you get back in your wagon and return to town." "This matter concerns the welfare of a child," Matilda protested. "That child," Preston said, pointing to where Emma could be seen through the cabin window in her cradle, "is being well cared for by her mother, who loves her more than life itself. I've seen nothing here that warrants interference from anyone, least of all those who'd separate a mother and child." Reverend Holcomb drew himself up to his full height, still several inches shorter than Preston. "The territorial authorities may see things differently. They're welcome to come and look for themselves," Preston replied evenly, "but until then you're not welcome here. Good day." For a moment, it seemed the Holcombs might argue further, but something in Preston's stance must have dissuaded them. With stiff nods, they climbed back into their wagon and departed, the dust from their wheels hanging in the still air. When they were out of sight, Tabitha's composure crumbled. "They'll try to take her from me," she whispered, tears welling. Preston placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No, they won't. I won't let that happen." "How can you stop it?" Tabitha asked, looking up at him with desperate hope. Preston met her gaze steadily. "There's a way, but it would require a significant change for both of us." Tabitha's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was suggesting. "Preston, hear me out," he said quickly. "A married woman with a husband to provide for her and her child would be above reproach. No court would remove a child from such a home." "You're proposing marriage?" Tabitha asked incredulously. "I'm proposing a solution," Preston clarified. "A practical arrangement that would benefit us both. You and Emma would have security and protection, and I would have—" He hesitated. "I would have a family again." Tabitha stepped back, overwhelmed. "This is too much. I can't ask you to sacrifice your future for us." "You didn't ask, I'm offering," Preston said simply. "Think about it, you don't have to answer right away." With that, he turned and walked toward the barn, leaving Tabitha standing in the yard, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Tabitha found Preston on the porch, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and staring at the stars. She sat beside him, closer than she would have dared a week ago. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said quietly. Preston stubbed out his cigarette. "And? Why would you do this?" Tabitha asked. "Marry a woman you barely know, take on another man's child as your own. It's an enormous sacrifice." Preston was silent for so long that Tabitha thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low in the darkness. "My sister Sarah was the only family I had left after our parents died, when I lost her and the children." He paused. "I've been drifting ever since, even after settling here. This land, this cabin, they're just possessions without people to share them with." He turned to look at her, his face half illuminated by the light from the window. "You and Emma need protection, I need purpose. Perhaps we can help each other." "A marriage of convenience," Tabitha said, testing the words. "At first," Preston acknowledged. "But who knows what might grow from it in time?" Tabitha considered his words carefully. She had not expected to marry after what had happened in Omaha. The thought of being that vulnerable again terrified her, but Preston had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. "If we did this," she said slowly, "I would want certain understandings between us." Preston nodded encouragingly. "I would be your wife in name, but—" Tabitha struggled to articulate her fears. "I'm not ready for all that marriage entails. I might never be." Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. "I would never force anything on you, Tabitha. Never. We would share a home, a name, a life if you're willing, but nothing more unless you wished it." Relief washed over her. "And Emma, would you be a father to her? In every way that matters," Preston promised. "She'd bear my name, inherit what I have, and never know a moment's doubt about her place in this family." Family. The word resonated in Tabitha's heart. A real family for Emma and perhaps healing for herself as well. "Then yes," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'll marry you, Preston O'Malley." Preston's face broke into a genuine smile, transforming his features. On impulse, he took her hand and pressed it gently to his lips. "I'll do right by you both, Tabitha. That's my solemn vow." The touch of his lips on her skin sent an unexpected warmth through her, a feeling she quickly suppressed. This was a practical arrangement, she reminded herself, not a love match. Yet as they sat together under the vast prairie sky, Tabitha felt something unfamiliar stirring within her, not quite hope, not quite desire, but something promising nonetheless. They were married 3 days later by a justice of the peace in the neighboring town of Hollister. Preston had insisted on the legal ceremony rather than simply presenting themselves as married, wanting no shadows over their union that could later be used against them. Tabitha wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color in her eyes, with a sprig of wildflowers in her hair that Preston had gathered that morning. Emma, dressed in a clean white gown, watched the proceedings with solemn eyes from the arms of the justice's wife, who had agreed to stand as witness. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Nebraska," the justice concluded, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. O'Malley." Preston hesitated, then leaned forward to place a chaste kiss on Tabitha's cheek. The gesture was gentle, respectful, and oddly moving in its restraint. As they rode home in Preston's wagon, Emma sleeping peacefully between them, Tabitha felt a curious mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a nervous anticipation about what this new life would bring. "Mrs. O'Malley," Preston said, testing the name as they approached the ranch. "How does it sound?" "Strange," Tabitha admitted with a small smile. "But not unpleasant," Preston laughed, a warm sound that Tabitha had heard only rarely. "High praise indeed." When they arrived at the cabin, their home now, Truly shared, Preston surprised her by lifting Emma carefully into one arm and offering Tabitha his other hand. "Tradition says I should carry you across the threshold," he explained, "but I think we'll have to settle for walking in together this first time." The simple acknowledgement that there might be other thresholds, other homes in their future, touched Tabitha deeply. She placed her hand in his, and together they entered the cabin, a family in more than just name. That night, true to his word, Preston slept on a pallet in the main room, leaving Tabitha and Emma the privacy of what had been the lean-to but was now undeniably their bedroom. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and her daughter's soft breathing, Tabitha reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been alone, frightened, and desperate. Now she was a married woman with a home and a husband who, if not a man she loved, was certainly a man she respected. For Emma's sake, and perhaps for her own as well, she would try to make this unusual marriage work. The following weeks brought adjustment and routine. Preston continued his work on the ranch, now with renewed purpose, while Tabitha managed the household with growing confidence. They established patterns and boundaries, learning to live together as partners if not yet as traditional husband and wife. Word of their marriage reached Ruby City quickly, causing no small stir among the townspeople. Preston reported that Reverend Holcomb had preached a sermon on the sanctity of marriage the Sunday after their wedding, though he had carefully avoided mentioning them by name. "Let them talk," Preston had said with a shrug when Tabitha expressed concern. "What matters is here on this ranch in this home," and gradually it began to feel like a true home. Tabitha planted a vegetable garden beside the cabin with Preston's help in turning the hard prairie soil. They built a chicken coop together, populating it with hens purchased from a neighboring farm. Emma began to crawl, exploring her expanded world with delighted determination. As summer turned to early autumn, the practical partnership between Preston and Tabitha deepened into something resembling friendship. They shared meals, conversation, and increasingly, laughter. Preston, Tabitha discovered, had a dry wit that emerged more frequently as he grew comfortable in their arrangement. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emma playing with wooden blocks Preston had carved for her, Tabitha found herself studying her husband's profile. The setting sun gilded his features, highlighting the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years in the sun, the small scar on his chin that she had never asked about. "You're staring," Preston observed without turning his head. Tabitha flushed. "I was just thinking how little I actually know about you despite being married to you." Preston turned to her then, his expression thoughtful. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Tabitha said simply. "Where were you born? What was your childhood like?" "How did you get that scar on your chin?" Preston laughed. "That's a lot of everything." He settled back in his chair. "I was born in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. My father worked in the steel mills until the fumes ruined his lungs. We moved west when I was 12, hoping the air would help him. It didn't, but by then we'd fallen in love with the open spaces." He told her about growing up in a small Kansas town, about his sister Sarah, who had been 10 years his senior and more mother than sibling after their parents died, about his first cattle drive at 17 and the years of wandering that followed. And the scar. Tabitha prompted when he fell silent. Preston touched it absently. "Bar fight in Dodge City. Another cowboy took exception to me winning at cards, said I was cheating, which I wasn't. His knife caught me before I could duck." "You've lived quite a life," Tabitha said, somewhat awed by the experiences that had shaped him. "Parts of it were worth living," Preston acknowledged. "Other parts I'd rather forget." He looked at her curiously. "What about you? What was little Tabitha Lane like growing up?" Tabitha smiled at the image. "Stubborn, according to my mother, always with my nose in a book when I should have been helping with chores. My father was a schoolteacher before he took up farming, and he encouraged my love of learning." "That explains why you're always correcting my grammar," Preston teased. "I do not," Tabitha protested, then caught the twinkle in his eye. "Well, perhaps occasionally." They shared stories as the sky darkened and stars appeared, talking more freely than they ever had before. When Emma began to fuss, signaling bedtime, they went inside together, the comfortable silence between them speaking of a barrier crossed, a new level of understanding reached. As Preston banked the fire for the night, he hesitated, then asked, Would you mind if I kissed Emma good night?" The request, so simple and yet so meaningful, brought tears to Tabitha's eyes. "Of course not. She's your daughter now, too." Preston followed her to Emma's cradle, where the sleepy child was fighting to keep her eyes open. He bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sweet dreams, little one," he whispered. When he straightened, he found Tabitha watching him, her expression soft in the lamplight. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his cheek, a fleeting caress that surprised them both. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you're doing for us." Preston caught her hand before she could withdraw it, holding it gently against his face. "I should be thanking you," he said, his voice husky. "You've brought life back to this place, to me." For a breathless moment, they stood frozen in the intimacy of the gesture. Then Emma made a small sound, breaking the spell, and they stepped apart, suddenly awkward. "Good night, Tabitha," Preston said, releasing her hand and moving toward his pallet in the main room. "Good night," she replied, her heart beating strangely fast as she closed the door to her bedroom. That night, lying in the darkness, Tabitha acknowledged to herself what she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was developing feelings for her husband. Feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship. Feelings that both excited and terrified her. The realization kept her awake long into the night, wondering what it would mean for their carefully constructed arrangement. The harvest season brought new rhythms to the ranch. Preston worked from dawn to dusk, bringing in the modest crops he had planted in the spring: corn, wheat, and vegetables that would sustain them through the winter. Tabitha preserved fruits and vegetables, drying some and canning others in the glass jars Preston had brought from town. They worked as a team now, their movements around each other comfortable and practiced. Preston would instinctively lift Emma when Tabitha's hands were full. Tabitha would have water ready when Preston came in dusty from the fields. Small kindnesses, unspoken considerations that formed the foundation of their growing bond. One crisp October morning, Preston announced he needed to ride into Ruby City for supplies. It would be Tabitha's first visit to town since their marriage, and she approached the prospect with trepidation. "You don't have to come," Preston assured her as he hitched the wagon. "I can manage the shopping." Tabitha squared her shoulders. "No, it's time. I won't hide forever. Besides, Emma needs warmer clothes for winter, and I should select the fabric myself." Preston studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes. "All right, then. But remember, you're Mrs. O'Malley now. You have nothing to be ashamed of." The ride to town was pleasant, the autumn air invigorating as they traveled the now familiar road. Emma, bundled warmly against the chill, babbled happily from her place on Tabitha's lap, occasionally reaching up to pat Preston's arm when he drove near enough. Ruby City appeared much as Tabitha remembered it, though with the strange distance that comes from seeing a once familiar place through changed eyes. As they pulled up in front of the general store, she felt rather than saw the attention they attracted. Preston helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering supportively at the small of her back as they entered the store together. Inside, several customers browsed the merchandise, all of whom fell silent at their entrance. Howard Mercer emerged from the back room, his expression shifting from shopkeeper's welcome to guarded neutrality when he recognized them. "Mr. O'Malley," he acknowledged, then with visible reluctance, "Mrs. O'Malley." The name, spoken publicly for the first time, sent a ripple through the store's occupants. Tabitha held her head high, unconsciously moving closer to Preston's solid presence. "Mr. Mercer," Preston replied evenly. "We're here to purchase supplies for the winter. My wife has a list." Tabitha produced the carefully written inventory, which Mercer took with barely concealed distaste. As he began gathering the items, the other customers gradually resumed their activities, though Tabitha could feel their covert glances. She was examining a bolt of warm flannel when a woman's voice spoke behind her. "Tabitha." She turned to find Martha Wilson, the milliner's wife and once one of her closest friends in Ruby City. Martha's expression was a mixture of curiosity and lingering disapproval. "Hello, Martha," Tabitha said quietly. "How are you?" "Well enough." Martha's eyes darted to Emma, who was watching the interaction solemnly from Tabitha's arms. "She's grown." "Babies do," Tabitha replied, unable to keep a hint of defensiveness from her voice. Martha hesitated, then asked in a lowered voice, Is it a real marriage?" The question, intrusive as it was, did not surprise Tabitha. She knew the town must be speculating about the nature of her sudden union with Preston. "Yes, Martha," she said firmly. "It is very real." Before Martha could respond, Preston appeared at Tabitha's side, his presence reassuring. "Mrs. Wilson," he said with a polite nod, "I hope we find you well." Martha flushed slightly. "Yes, thank you, Mr. O'Malley. I was just catching up with Tabitha, that is, Mrs. O'Malley." "Perhaps you'd like to visit the ranch sometime," Preston suggested, surprising both women. "My wife makes an excellent apple pie, and I'm sure she'd appreciate female company now and then." The invitation, so normal and neighborly, seemed to catch Martha off guard. "That would be lovely," she managed, though her tone suggested she had no intention of accepting. Preston smiled as if he hadn't noticed her discomfort. "Wonderful. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a few more stops to make." He guided Tabitha toward the counter, where Mercer had assembled their purchases. The total came to more than Tabitha had expected, and she suspected the shopkeeper had inflated the prices, but Preston paid without comment. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Tabitha noticed a group of men outside the saloon watching them, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. She recognized Silas Turner, the livery owner, among them. "Don't mind them," Preston murmured, helping her onto the wagon seat. "Their opinions matter less than a prairie dog's." Tabitha managed a smile, though her heart was heavy. "I'd hoped things might be different now." "Give it time," Preston advised as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "People are slow to change their minds, but they do eventually, especially when they see we're not going anywhere." As they drove out of town, Tabitha glanced back at the diminishing buildings. Will it always be like this? The stares, the whispers, the judgment. "No," Preston said with quiet certainty. "Someday they'll find someone else to gossip about, and we'll just be the O'Malleys, that family with the ranch outside town." The confidence in his voice was comforting, as was the casual way he had referred to them as a family. Despite the discomfort of the town visit, Tabitha felt a renewed sense of hope as they traveled home. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Tabitha found Preston at the kitchen table, working on the ranch's accounts. She set a cup of coffee beside him and took the chair opposite. "Thank you for today," she said simply. Preston looked up, his pen pausing mid-calculation. "For what?" "For standing beside me. For treating me like a wife to be proud of, not a burden to be tolerated." A flicker of something hurt, perhaps, crossed Preston's face. "Is that what you think?" "That I consider you a burden? No," Tabitha said quickly. "But you could have, many men would." Preston set down his pen. "Tabitha, when I asked you to marry me, it wasn't just for your benefit or Emma's, it was for mine as well." He held her gaze. "Having you both here, making this place a home. It's given me something I didn't know I was missing." The sincerity in his eyes made Tabitha's breath catch. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "I never expected to find this, whatever this is between us." Preston reached across the table, his hand open in invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Tabitha placed her hand in his. His fingers were work-roughened but warm as they closed around hers. "I care for you," Preston said, the words plainly spoken but heavy with meaning. "More than I expected to, more than perhaps I should, given our arrangement." Tabitha's heart beat faster. I care for you too, she whispered, the admission both frightening and freeing, but I'm afraid. Of what? Preston asked gently, of trusting, of being vulnerable again. Tabitha looked down at their joined hands, of wanting more than you're prepared to give. Preston tightened his hold slightly. What if I want more too? The question hung in the air between them, full of possibility and risk. Tabitha met his gaze again, seeing in it a reflection of her own longing and uncertainty. Then perhaps, she said carefully, we should consider renegotiating our arrangement. A slow smile spread across Preston's face, warming his usually serious features. I'd like that. That night, for the first time, Preston didn't sleep on his pallet in the main room. Instead, he shared Tabitha's bed, though they did nothing more than hold each other, his strong arms around her as she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was a beginning tentative, fragile but full of promise. The winter of 1878-79 proved harsh, with blizzards sweeping across the Nebraska plains and temperatures dropping to bitter lows. The O'Malley Ranch, like others in the region, battened down against the elements, its occupants drawing closer in the enforced intimacy of the season. Preston had prepared well, ensuring they had ample firewood, preserved food, and fodder for the livestock. The cabin, though small, was snug against the howling winds, its stone fireplace radiating welcome heat through the long nights. For Tabitha, the winter brought both challenges and unexpected joys. The confinement might have been stifling, but she found herself treasuring the evenings spent by the fire, Preston reading aloud from one of the few books they owned while she sewed or knitted, Emma playing on a blanket at their feet. Their relationship continued to evolve, growing deeper and more complex as they cautiously explored their feelings for each other. Preston never pushed, always letting Tabitha set the pace of their increasing intimacy, his patience and consideration gradually helping her overcome the fears left by her trauma. On Christmas Eve, Preston surprised Tabitha with a gift, a silver locket he'd purchased months ago in Hollister and kept hidden for the occasion. Inside was a small portrait he'd commissioned from a traveling photographer who had passed through the area in the fall, capturing the three of them together. "So you'll always have us with you," he explained as she examined it with tear-filled eyes. "It's beautiful," Tabitha whispered, fastening it around her neck. "But I have nothing for you," Preston smiled, cupping her face gently in his hands. "You've given me more than I ever thought to have again," he said softly. "A home, a family, a reason to wake up each morning." He kissed her then, not the chaste pecks they had shared before, but a true kiss, tender and full of unspoken emotion. Tabitha responded, her arms circling his neck, her heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and desire. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Tabitha O'Malley," he said, the words emerging as if they could no longer be contained. "I think I have almost from the beginning." Tabitha felt tears spill onto her cheeks. "I love you too," she admitted, the truth of it washing through her like a cleansing tide. "I've been so afraid to say it, to feel it." "No more fear," Preston promised, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Not between us." That night, in the soft glow of the firelight, their marriage became complete in every sense. Tabitha discovered that intimacy with a man who truly loved and respected her was nothing like the violence she had experienced before. Preston's touch was gentle, his concern for her comfort paramount, and in his arms she found not just pleasure but healing. Afterward, lying together in the quiet darkness, Tabitha felt a peace she had not known in years. "Thank you," she whispered against Preston's chest. "For what?" He asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "For waiting, for understanding, for loving me when I thought no one ever would again." Preston pressed a kiss to her hair. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done," he said simply, "and the most rewarding." As winter slowly yielded to spring, Tabitha realized with mingled surprise and joy that she was expecting a child, Preston's child. When she shared the news, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for, his face lighting with wonder and happiness. "A baby," he repeated, his hand hovering reverently over her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you pleased?" Tabitha asked, though his expression already answered the question. "More than I can say," Preston assured her, gathering her into a careful embrace. "When? Late summer, I think." "August or September," Preston nodded thoughtfully. "We should expand the cabin before then, add another bedroom." The practicality of his response made Tabitha laugh. "Always planning ahead, aren't you? For my family, always." His smile was tender as he looked from her to Emma, who at 15 months was now walking unsteadily around the cabin, babbling a mixture of real words and her own private language. "We're going to need more space for all these O'Malleys." Throughout the spring, Preston worked on the cabin addition whenever weather and ranch duties permitted. Tabitha helped where she could, her pregnancy progressing smoothly as Emma grew increasingly curious about her mother's changing body. "Baby," Emma would say, patting Tabitha's rounding stomach with solemn concentration. "Baby in there." "That's right, sweetheart," Tabitha would confirm. "Your little brother or sister is growing in Mama's tummy." "Out soon?" Emma would ask hopefully. "Not for a while yet," Preston would explain, lifting his daughter into his arms. "The baby has to grow big and strong first, just like you did." The tenderness with which Preston treated both Tabitha and Emma never ceased to move her. He had legally adopted Emma as his own shortly after their marriage, insisting that she should bear his name and have all the rights of a natural child. Now, he approached the prospect of fatherhood again with a mixture of excitement and reverence that made Tabitha love him all the more. As summer approached, Tabitha's condition became more noticeable, and Preston insisted they make another trip to Ruby City for supplies before travel became too uncomfortable for her. Tabitha agreed, curious despite herself about how the town might react to this visible evidence of their union. Their reception in Ruby City was noticeably different from their winter visit. While not exactly warm, the townspeople were less overtly hostile, some even offering tentative congratulations when they noticed Tabitha's condition. "The gossip has died down somewhat," Martha Wilson informed Tabitha when they encountered each other in the general store. "Especially since the Petersons' daughter ran off with that traveling salesman. That's all anyone's talking about now." Tabitha couldn't help but smile at the confirmation of Preston's prediction. "I'm sorry to hear about the Petersons' trouble," she said diplomatically. Martha hesitated, then added with a hint of her old warmth, "You're looking well, Tabitha. Marriage seems to agree with you." "It does," Tabitha confirmed, exchanging a glance with Preston, who was examining farm tools nearby but clearly keeping an ear on their conversation. "Very much so." As they prepared to leave town, Tabitha was surprised to see Reverend Holcomb approaching their wagon. Preston tensed beside her, his expression wary. "Mr. and Mrs. O'Malley," the minister greeted them, his tone civil if not friendly. "I trust you are well." "Very well, thank you, Reverend," Preston replied guardedly. Holcomb cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We have not seen you in church for some time." Tabitha exchanged a surprised look with Preston. This was not the confrontation she had expected. "We've found our own ways to worship," Preston said carefully, "given the circumstances." The Reverend nodded, his eyes flicking to Tabitha's pregnant form and then away. "I understand. However, I wanted to say that you would be welcome should you wish to attend services." He hesitated, then added stiffly, "Both of you, and the children, of course." It was as close to an apology as they were likely to get, Tabitha realized. She glanced at Preston, who gave a slight nod, leaving the response to her. "Thank you, Reverend," she said sincerely. "We'll consider it." As they drove away from town, Tabitha leaned against Preston's shoulder. "Things are changing," she observed. "People are," Preston corrected. "Slowly, but they are," he smiled down at her. "Or maybe we are." "Both, I think," Tabitha said, placing her hand over his on the reins, "but I'm glad for it." In August, just as the prairie grasses were turning golden under the hot summer sun, Tabitha went into labor. Preston, who had been preparing for this moment with characteristic thoroughness, sent word to the midwife in Hollister and transformed the cabin into a birthing room with quiet efficiency. Emma, now nearly 18 months old, was cared for by a neighbor woman who had become friendly with Tabitha over the summer, while Preston remained close at hand, his concern evident but controlled for Tabitha's sake. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and as dawn broke over the eastern horizon, Thomas James O'Malley entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes. Preston, who had remained outside during the final stages as was customary, was called in to meet his son, his face a study in wonder as the midwife placed the swaddled infant in his arms. "He's perfect," Preston whispered, carefully sitting beside Tabitha on the bed. "Look what we made." Tabitha, exhausted but radiant, reached out to touch her son's tiny hand. "He has your chin," she observed with a tired smile, "and hopefully not your stubbornness." Preston laughed softly, says the most stubborn woman in Nebraska territory. The midwife discreetly left them alone, going to check on Emma, who had been brought back to the cabin now that the birth was complete. Soon, Preston carefully carried the baby into the main room so that Emma could meet her brother. "Baby out now?" Emma asked, peering curiously at the bundle in her father's arms. "Yes, sweetheart," Preston confirmed, kneeling to her level. "This is your brother, Thomas. Can you say hello?" Emma regarded the infant solemnly, then reached out to pat his cheek with surprising gentleness. "Hello, Thomas," she said carefully. Emma, your big sister." The simple declaration brought a lump to Preston's throat. "That's right," he managed. "You're his big sister, and you'll help Mama and Papa take care of him, won't you?" Emma nodded with all the seriousness a toddler could muster. "I help, I good helper." Preston pulled her into a one-armed hug, balancing Thomas in the other arm. "Yes, you are. The very best." The first weeks with the new baby passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and adjustments to their family rhythm. Preston proved as capable and supportive with an infant as he was in all other aspects of their life together, taking on many of Emma's care needs to allow Tabitha to focus on Thomas. In October, when Thomas was 2 months old and sturdy enough for travel, they made a significant decision. On a crisp Sunday morning, the O'Malley family attended services at the Ruby City Church for the first time. Their entrance caused a momentary hush, but Reverend Holcomb greeted them warmly, making a point of welcoming them before the congregation. They sat in a pew near the back, Emma between them and Thomas sleeping in Tabitha's arms. After the service, several townspeople approached them, some merely curious, others genuinely welcoming. Martha Wilson cooed over Thomas and declared that Emma had grown inches since she'd last seen her. Howard Mercer's wife invited them to dinner the following Sunday, an invitation they accepted with surprised pleasure. As they drove home, Tabitha reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "It's strange," she said to Preston. "A year and a half ago, I was leaving that town in disgrace with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Now we're returning as a family, accepted if not entirely forgiven." Preston reached over to squeeze her hand. "You never needed their forgiveness, Tabitha. You did nothing wrong." "I know that now," she said softly. "You helped me see it." They crested the rise that led to their ranch, and Tabitha felt the familiar surge of gratitude and love at the sight of their home. The cabin, expanded and improved by Preston's skilled hands, stood solid against the prairie winds. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, the corrals holding horses and cattle that represented their growing prosperity. But it wasn't the buildings or livestock that made her heart swell with contentment, it was the knowledge that within those walls was a life she had never dared to hope for. A husband who loved her completely, children who thrived under their care, and a future full of possibilities. As Preston helped her down from the wagon, Thomas still sleeping against her shoulder and Emma chattering excitedly about the singing place they had visited, Tabitha paused to look up at the man who had changed her life with a simple offer of shelter. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for all she felt, Preston's smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "For what?" "For building me a home," Tabitha replied. "Not just the cabin, but this," she gestured to encompass their family, their life together. "All of this." Preston leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that still thrilled her after months of marriage. "We built it together," he corrected gently. "And we'll keep building it day by day for the rest of our lives." Tabitha smiled, knowing the truth of his words in her heart. What had begun as an act of kindness had grown into something neither of them could have imagined: a love strong enough to weather any storm, a family bound by choice rather than obligation, and a home that stood as testament to the power of compassion over judgment. As they walked together toward the cabin, their children between them, Tabitha knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. Not just a shelter from the world's cruelty, but a place of love, acceptance, and endless possibility. The town had shunned her, but in doing so, had set her on the path to true happiness. And Preston, her unlikely savior, her devoted husband, the father of her children, had built her not just a house, but a home where love would always dwell.